I wanted to share my thoughts about the Aukus submarine deal. I'll preface that discussion with obviously stating that I have no experience in the field of defense. My thoughts are based on my experience as a board member and looking at the deal from a layman's viewpoint, from a risk management and value for money, what the deal offers, pros and cons. Um, so the total spend on the Ekis deal is close to $360 billion over a long period of time, more than a decade, a couple of decades, and there's a phased introduction, obviously, initially of rotational visits by British and US uh, naval vessels, and then gradually acquisition of the Virginia class nuclear subs, the second-hand nuclear subs, with an effective life of around 33 years um, from the US, and then a bespoke build of um, subs that will carry the Australian flag, and that'll happen sometimes in another 20-25 years, all things going well, as per the project plan. Now, the first question that came to my mind on seeing this deal, or when the talk about this deal was on, has been that are nuclear subs offensive or defensive weapons? Um, Obviously, they're very powerful naval weapons, and they can be used both for offense and defense. Now, from a defense viewpoint, obviously the biggest task would be protecting Australia's shores, ostensibly protecting Australia's shoreline, and but protecting it against what? What's the threat? One threat would be, one extreme threat would be a Chinese surface fleet with carrying soldiers appearing on the horizon. Now, if that has happened, then the question would arise, obviously, if that eventuality happens, that the question arises, obviously, is that has the US and the Allies lost the war in that scenario? And that is why that enemy fleet is on the horizon. So that's a quite an interesting question around why of how the submarine fleet could defend the shores at a practical level. Uh, the more realistic prospect of using the fleet might be to prevent a blockade. Currently, um, there are only two refineries for domestic use of oil. In 1990, there were 8 refineries, and majority of the oil, refined oil that is used by industry, comes from Singapore. So any enemy action might block the sea routes through which oil comes, and that would cripple the entire economy, uh, nuclear subs or not. So the or will the subs be able to prevent a blockade and keep the shipping routes open is obviously a very big question. If they're available and they're built, and then the conflict occurs, obviously. Now, can the subs, can 8 subs, or 6 to 8 subs, what is being built approximately, be able to sort of do an effective sort of deterrence against any blockade of the trade routes? And will additional US ships and naval vessels or other naval assets come to aid Australia in that situation? Um, uh, the time frame for the delivery of the subs is obviously very long. The first subs would come in 10 years, maybe a bit more. Um, and these are the second-hand Virginia class subs, and then the indigenous built ones. So now, if you listen to all the predictions of possible international conflict around Taiwan or South China Sea, for example, that's all slated to happen in the next 4 or 5 years. Now, if that happens, um, what and if we're drawn in, what are we going to how are we going to counter that? Is there our risk around the refineries, which is one of the key risks? If you don't have fuel, you can't run your planes, tanks, guns, industry, anything. Um, should we is money better spent or partly spent at least on building more refineries, even if it might cost a lot more to refine oil locally, but that's the cost of defense, or a more practical aspect of defense. Um, the other thing I was thinking of is, what impact might any change of government in the US have on the whole planned build? There are, similar to the 1940s, very significantly isolationist um, GOP candidates like Trump and Ron DeSantis, who have shown a significant disinclination to have anything to do with international interventions, and might very well turn around and decide that America first takes precedence, and building subs to Central Australia may not be high on their priority. So, what's the possibility that the project is stranded midway because of any change of government? Um, the history of, having said all, the counterbalance to that is also the history. If you look back on history, the Battle of the Coral Sea that happened after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the Battle of the Coral Sea happened around February, March 1942. And at that stage, the Japanese were at the doorsteps of Papua New Guinea, ready to mount an invasion of Northern Australia if they managed to get a foothold on Papua New Guinea. And it was the US fleet that steamed down to engage in the Battle of the Coral Sea, and that sort of ended in a stalemate with a technical victory for the Americans. But that entire battle was fought by the American Navy. So, if there is any significant defense of the shores of Australia in future that is needed, and may the day never come, is it realistic to assume that we can follow a sort of defense policy that does not take into account American Navy assets coming to the aid to fight that battle? Um, and the same with the US airfields and the US presence in Northern Australia in terms of airfields, etc. So, the third aspect of that is a quid pro quo with Taiwan. There's a lot of talk of Australia getting drawn into any possible conflict of saving Taiwan. But what's the quid pro quo for that? If we have to defend our shores and expect the US to help in that, and need the help to practically defend our shores, nuclear subs or not, then is it possible not to offer help at a practical level, um, leaving aside politics to, if help is asked in the case of defending Taiwan, and the consequences of any trade blockades, etc., which might anyhow impact the shipping lanes which bring in critical supplies to Australia, which is a big risk from that viewpoint. Um, the, in terms of alternatives to nuclear subs for defensive purposes, having a large number of shore-based missile systems that can knock out an incoming fleet is also viable option, and that's being partly being undertaken at the moment. Also having a large fleet of aircraft, um, um, and that fleet might not necessarily um, be the best sophisticated fleet, but what history has shown once again is that quantity does matter over quality. When you have a large number of aircraft, then even if half of them are shot down, you might succeed in sinking the vessels of any seaborne fleet in the process. Um, so that quantity quality discussion is also there on what will practically defend the shores of Australia if such a grim situation ever occurred. Now, a good example of that was in the Falklands War, where the British traveled thousands of kilometers to defend, to reacquire, to uh, take back the Falkland Islands, and the British fleet um, came under fire from exocet missiles that were land based from the Argentinian forces, and also primitive planes, one of which got through and managed to sink one British um, ship by evading radar. Uh, the British also were able to ironically use a nuclear sub to sink a Argentinian aircraft carrier. But what that conflict shows is that relatively unsophisticated equipment, planes or surface-to-air missiles, can still wreak havoc on a surface fleet which is coming inbound with hostile intentions. So that's an interesting paradigm to continue. And the final point that I would like to share thoughts about is the complexity of the build. Uh, we're literally having to build everything, the skills, the expertise, and everything for the Australian component of this build from the ground up. And is that realistically possible to build that sort of capacity over the time frames that are involved? And are the time frames enough? Is it realistically possible not to expect that there are cost blowouts or time frame blowouts in such a long duration project? And once again, how does that impact in real terms the defense of our island continent? Um, and finally, one final point is technological obsolescence. If the first second-hand subs are going to land in the water in the 2030s, then what about technological obsolescence? Technology is evolving at a rapid pace. ChatGPT is the latest example that is supposed to change the world. I'm not convinced myself about whether that would change the world for anything good, but nevertheless, it promises to change the world. But if you look at that pace of change, then what sort of weapon naval assets will be available in another 7 to 10 years is also moot for consideration, and whether you're paying for a product which will be obsolete very soon once it hits the water. Now, these are all competing considerations in defending Australia, Australian shores, our way of life, our economy. And for me personally, the greatest risk is still the lack of locally stored fuel and how quickly that can bring the entire economy to a halt, and the need to develop local refining so that at the very least we have 6 months or 8 months of fuel supplies to run the entire economy. And in a wartime, that might not be enough, leaving aside the 2 weeks or 3 weeks of onshore storage that we have, and which will definitely prove to be entirely inadequate if conflict broke out. Interested to hear everyone else's thoughts around some of the pros and cons that I have outlined in this video. Thank you.